Okay, I hope you find that exercise was useful and difficult, no doubt, but also an opportunity to try to access what are sometimes really difficult to access feelings. In this last part of the lecture today, I'm going to talk about um, how writing can come out of that place and why writing has a deep connection to that place. This is a lovely quote. It means a lot to me from the poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen, Canadian as well. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And so this, I think, is what we need to do when we're writing through grief. And as Gail Jones points out, she's an Australian writer. We need to find a way to do it that honors it. She asks, I think, what's a really profound question here. How does one honor in grief all that uprises? And then how does one write about it? One of the questions about honor, of course, is the question I rose at the beginning of the lecture about writing about deeply personal experiences and the ethics of representing others who might be vulnerable in those situations as well. And no doubt that Emma will cover those issues with you throughout this subject in far more deep ways than I can. But of course, there's just practical reason here is it's a self-protective mechanism that our heart sometimes gets sealed off from our head, and if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to walk around in the world and go to work and do things sometimes when we're experiencing deep pain. But at the same time, we need to find a way to access that. And different people have different ideas about when is the right time to start writing about grief. Some people are writers who write in their notebooks daily, who keep morning pages. Others feel like in order to honor grief, you probably need to be well enough first before you can start to open up some of those dark places. And other people feel that no time is the wrong time to write with grief, that grief is healing, and you're going to find the spectrum and the gamut, and there's large narrative academic debates about these things as well. Now, I am, like other contemporary theorists of grief, I'm interested in its complexity rather than its neat stages. Amy Prodromou is an Australian theorist of women's grief memoirs, and she's written one herself. And she calls these artifacts of textured recovery. And I think this really connects with the point that I'm trying to make here about the visceral nature of grief. Grief isn't so much a concept as an experience. And it's like an onion, it just peels and peels and peels, and the more you peel back, the more you uncover. So grief narratives, she says, in their very narrative complexity, tend to resist the neat split conceived by clinical models of grief between what is normal grief or complicated or prolonged or pathological grief. For her, she says, when you read any narrative of grief, it doesn't fit any kind of neat narrative model. I also think there's lots of ways to respond to grief that don't involve necessarily writing, that are healing too, that can involve other forms of art that people might be called to make. And this is a project I think is a really powerful one. It comes out of Regional Arts WA, called Reclaim the Void. And it's a project where a British artist actually approached a number of First Nations elders, beginning in Maralinga, the place of atomic bomb testing, but also around sites that have been mined in Australia over Aboriginal land. This is just a little screenshot from the website, this news story here from Regional Arts WA. And I just want to read it. This is the person involved in actually producing a narrative, a yarn, literally a yarn of her grief. And talking about meeting the British artist who proposed this project. We had a wonderful meeting and the community liked his ideas and how they could be involved, she said. However, I felt there was something else, some unspoken pain. I found myself asking, what is your deepest pain? And one of the aunties said, it's those gaping mining holes left all over our country. Perhaps being a Wajala wishing to fix things, I spontaneously said, why don't we do a project where we seal one of those holes with something that carries the story of your country? And the auntie looked at me with eyes with such gravitas and sincerity and said, yes, do that. And so you can read about this as a project where they've created yarn quilts, thousands of them, to fill this void, this scar of grief. And I think it talks about both the difficulty, the unspoken nature of some pain, also the visceral nature of grief, and also the powerful nature of art making in healing wounds. Related to grief, and I'm not sure if you're going to be learning any more about this in Emma's class, is a whole body of work on the nature of trauma. Trauma and grief are often, but not always, linked. But like grief, trauma was very late to be theorized in ways beyond the superficial ways that Freud had in at the turn of the century. In 1992, Judith Lewis Herman wrote a really powerful book called Trauma and Recovery, and it's been reissued and reprinted many times. And one of the things that she talked about in that book is the very nature of trauma being the fact that it is beyond conceptual experience. It's often something that defies our paradigms of what's normal, what's everyday. And it's something that often defies language. It's hard to speak. It's hard to find the right words for it. It's something we experience viscerally, phenomenologically, more often than through the mediated words of our mind. And so connecting those two things is really difficult. And this book is a fascinating read in terms of the things that psychologists began to understand in the 1990s about the way people respond to trauma in their bodies, often by actually counterintuitively reenacting trauma, finding, for instance, that rape victims tend to put themselves in situations where they are abused again and again and again. And finding out that there are examples of that with other kinds of sufferers of PTSD. It's just a feature of PTSD that people often re-experience and reenact in a way to try to control and understand something that felt uncontrollable to them. And that's just one of the many insights that Judith Lewis Herman made, along with a really important insight, which is that despite the fact that trauma is so often wordless. Language plays an instrumental and foundational role in healing trauma. Finding words for that wordless experience is so powerful. And in 2007, trauma theory entered into literary studies as well through the work of Kathy Carruth, who talked about this idea of unclaimed experience, both at the personal level or at the cultural level, for instance, in terms of the Holocaust or First Nations experience, victims of war, for example, and the importance of language, of recognizing the role that literature had played in narrating the horrors of history that had been unspeakable at a personal or a cultural level. So here we're getting to an understanding of why narrative is so important for not just therapeutic reasons, but for us as cultures to begin to come to terms with the nature of trauma and our traumatic histories. And I think what is really clear here is the difference between medical and clinical models of grief and trauma and narrative models of grief and trauma that are beginning to emerge. So you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief. It's something that psychologists will, tell you today if you go down to a session and have a meeting with a counselor, although their understandings of it are far more nuanced than they were in 1968 when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously came up with this 5 stages of grief theory. And the way they're more nuanced now is that psychologists tend to acknowledge that not everybody goes through all 5 stages when they're grieving, and also that not everybody goes through them in a sequential order. But basically the idea is that, at the beginning of grief, whether that's the immediate loss of someone or immediate diagnosis of something, you deny, because it's really hard for you to imagine that this person is really gone or that this is really true. And then once you allow your mind to acknowledge that, you're very angry at yourself and others and life circumstances and society being unjust and life being unfair. And then she said you go through a phase of bargaining maybe with God or with the hospital, the doctor who had diagnosed you or whatever, just begging for something that you could do to make the situation different. And then as you begin to accept, the first level of acceptance is melancholy, depression. You just feel overwhelmingly sad because you finally acknowledged that this is the existential reality of the situation. And the 5th, when you're normal again, is accepting it. And you can see I'm laughing a bit because I just find it difficult to accept that acceptance is something that ever really fully occurs. What I'm far more engaged with is a book like this one by Arthur Frank, The Wounded Storyteller, Body, Illness, and Ethics. It's gone through many different editions, and since it was first published in 1995, it has opened up a whole field in the work on illness and on narrative therapy in particular. It's been really important to scholars of literary theory as well as to palliative care professionals. And it's a collection of really stirring accounts of illness stories, ranging from people who are quite famous to private testimonials of people who struggled with cancer or chronic fatigue syndrome or disability. And what he does in studying these stories is show that these accounts are more than just information, data for a clinician to understand suffering, but that they amount to the role of storytelling and healing. and just such an encouragement for people to go to those places of difficulty, often not just for themselves, but for what they can do to give meaning to their what can seem meaningless or arbitrary experience by helping others through their story. So that's really all I have to say today. There's a lot more to say, of course, about grief, and I would encourage you to engage a little bit with some of the theory around it in literary studies. An academic from WA who I really respect, who's written quite a bit on grief, is called Rachel Robertson. She's got a piece here that I've listed called Learning to Grieve. I've already mentioned the work of Amy Prodromo Caterini. Her book is called Navigating Loss in Women's Contemporary Memoir. And then there's a number of memoirs that I would suggest you might wish to look up besides the ones that I've mentioned today in the lecture. So Aftermath, Violence and the Remaking of the Self, which is sort of part theory and also a memoir. Susan Bryson. Lucky by Alice Sebold, probably the most well-known rape narrative. The Year of Magical Thinking, probably the most well-known memoir of loss, when Joan Didion accounts the year that both her husband and her daughter died. The Things They Carried, it's supposedly fictional, but Tim O'Brien was a Vietnam vet, and it is based on his experience of people he met experiencing war trauma, and it covers PTSD. And then, of course, you've probably heard of Wild, which was made into a film starring Reese Witherspoon by Cheryl Strayed, about how a woman undertakes a hike on the Pacific Coast Trail to come to terms with the grief and the aftermath of the loss of her mother. So I hope this wasn't too dark for you today. I hope it's encouraged you.